Welcome to composting and sustainability and composting at home and the workplace, everyone. So my name's Adam Rains. I'm on the ACT Coordinating Committee for National Science Week. And while it's a little unfortunate that we weren't able to meet in person at Mount Stromlo as we originally planned, hopefully here it means, since this will be recorded and put up later, more people will be able to see, the work that Phil's done at Mount Stromlo, what he has to say today. But before we go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Canberra sits, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and acknowledge their elders past and present, as well as their long history and continuing traditions of sustainability and sustainable land management. So I'm going to throw to Phil, so Dr. Philip Taylor is a theoretical astrophysicist at Mount Stromlo Observatory at the Australian National University. And so during the day, he uses supercomputers to simulate, makes his own universe in a computer and simulate how galaxies evolve. But when he's not doing that, he's leading sustainability efforts at the observatory to make us more sustainable and lower our carbon footprints and, reduce waste. And I'll throw to Phil. Take it away, Phil.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as Adam said, today I'm going to be talking about sustainability and composting at home and in the workplace. So I guess a good place to start will be to really sort of define what I mean by sustainability, because it's sort of used as a catch-all term sometimes. So sustainability for me does not begin and end at climate change and carbon emissions. Obviously these are extremely important issues, and I'll be talking a lot about them today, but there's more to it than that. So it's about not exploiting and overusing natural resources. It's about keeping the land and the seas and the air clean, healthy, and free from pollution. And so in that spirit, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. I personally am on the lands of the Ngunnawal people in what's now the ACT. And I note that Indigenous people have lived here sustainably for tens of thousands of years. And I really see it as our duty to continue to treat the planet with respect as they did. So a little bit about me. As Adam said, I work at Mount Stromlo Observatory at the ANU. But I'm really happiest when I'm not sitting behind a computer. I like to be out in nature. And so I've just put up a few of my favorite pictures I've taken over the years of some of Australia's various famous and not so famous animals. So you've got kangaroos, koalas, wombats, platypus and echidna down the left hand side. Probably all familiar with these. Maybe not so familiar. We've also got a superb parrot, a redneck wallaby, bettong, and a red-tailed black cockatoo. And I think you may be able to tell from my accent. I'm not from Australia originally, and it's really exciting for me whenever I see these animals out in the wild. Unfortunately, many of these animals, many of these species are under threat. And so even animals as well known and famous as the koala, there's a risk that they'll be extinct in New South Wales by 2050 without urgent intervention. And this is really due primarily to land clearing and climate change. The platypus, a similarly famous animal that's recognized around the world. We don't actually know the status of this species. It's probably threatened, but we just don't have the data on it at the moment. And again, the sort of threats that they're facing are climate change, introduced predators, drought and water mismanagement. The superb parrot is a parrot you might see around Canberra quite a lot. But they're actually listed as vulnerable, primarily due to habitat loss and logging, competition for resources with other parrots, and also climate change. I'm being told there's a bit of an echo on my end. I should put a headset on, so I will do that. Bear with me one moment. So the bettong, also this used to be quite common on the mainland, but has gone extinct since colonization due to introduced predators and climate change again. Populations still exist in Tasmania, and there's reintroduced populations in the ACT as well in contained nature reserves, predator-free nature reserves. Finally, also the red-tailed black cockatoo, again listed as vulnerable. This is a west coast species, but it's affected by land clearing and fire, climate change, and competition for resources again. So obviously there's lots of issues and with very complex interconnections happening here, but sort of what links them all together is climate change, and so there will be quite a lot of talk about that today. And so I think it's useful just to understand where we've come from. So I'll speak a bit to the history of climate change now. And so the first sort of research, if you like, on climate change was published in 1856 by Eunice Foote. She published some research called Circumstances Affecting the Heat of the Sun's Rays. And what this was, it was an experiment looking at how gases like carbon dioxide and water vapor, absorbed infrared radiation, which is a wavelength of light. And based on the results from this experiment, she made sort of very tentative links to the effect on the climate, but obviously, you know, this wasn't such a big issue back then. So moving forward a few decades to 1912, this is an extract from a newspaper in New Zealand, and they note that the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. And when this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. This carbon dioxide tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. And so I think what this shows is that people knew the science back then. They understood the risk of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It wasn't yet a major issue. And certainly they didn't have the technology that we have today that would be necessary to replace burning coal. But this is something where the science was understood, and it was known that it could be an issue. And so we'll skip forward a few more decades now to the 1980s. And this is research that was actually carried out by ExxonMobil, the petrol company. They have their own sort of in-house research scientists. And in 1982, they made this prediction, this graph, which is showing, so on the left-hand side, this is atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. And on the right-hand side is the corresponding temperature increase. And on the bottom is the year. And so in 1982, they predicted that by 2020, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere would be around 415 parts per million, and that would lead to an average global temperature increase of around 0.9 degrees C. What actually happened, now that we've had 2020 and we can measure these things, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was indeed 415 parts per million in 2020, and the mean temperature, the mean global temperature increased 0.9 degrees C a few years earlier in 2017. So, of course, Exxon were not alone in this. All the petrol companies, the petrochemical companies, will have had their own in-house research. So this will have been fairly widely known. But they chose to suppress this information. They chose to, try and suppress independent scientists who try to raise the alarm about this. So really my point here is they've known for 40 years at least, these companies, what the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would do, and they have chosen to actively work against fixing that problem in any way. So a few years later, in 1987, as a write-up from the Canberra Times, but in Melbourne that year, there was sort of the first big climate science meeting in Australia. This was really the first time sort of Australian climate scientists all came together and really, work on this issue. I've focused on a few excerpts here. So they warned that 1 in 50-year events are going to become 1 in 1 year events if we sort of continue, if they continue on the path that they were on. And they also say that the more rapid climate change is, the more difficult and costly it will be to deal with. And in 1987, they said, that's why it's so important that we slow it down now. Now, of course, that didn't happen. And, we're seeing these rare events, as predicted, are becoming much more common. So the science behind this has been well known for over 100 years now, to scientists and also to the fossil fuel companies. So you may well ask the question, why haven't we done more about this if we all knew it was a problem? So I think as well as the active work from the fossil fuel side, there's been inaction, on purpose from politicians as well. So I've just flagging here a few comments from this year from the Prime Minister and also the Deputy PM. So Scott Morrison said that coal mining will continue to generate wealth for Australians for decades to come. And Michael McCormack has said that he's not worried about what might happen in 30 years' time. And that's sort of, the issue with politics, right? They work on 5-year timescales, more or less. It's not economically sensible for them to think about what's going to happen in decades. And so really my opinion, my sort of takeaway on this is that there's no trickle-down action on climate change. So there's this often repeated fact that 70% of the world's carbon emissions come from just 100 companies. And that's true. But people then suggest that therefore there's no point for people like you and me to really do anything. We have to get industry and politicians. They're the people who can change this. And that's sort of true. But as I say here, there's no trickle-down action on climate change. We can't wait for the people who can make the biggest difference to do so. They've had at least 40 years knowing that this was a problem, and they've shown that they're not going to do this unless they're pressured to. And so I really think it is important for individuals to do what they can. And when I say individuals and sort of what an individual can do, that might be what you can do quite literally as an individual in your own household. Or it might be sort of what everyday people can do coming together to solve these problems. Or indeed to pressure governments and industry, which would be a good thing to do. So what can I do as an individual? So this is not a comprehensive list, but there's sort of obvious things. So I'm sure many of us have heard time and time again: reduce, reuse, recycle. I've included repair here as well. I think that's you know, quite an important thing that we can do as well, that isn't often considered. But here, when we say reduce, what it means is we don't want to create waste or carbon emissions, something like that, in the first place. And if we don't create it in the first place, then we don't have to deal with it. Easy peasy. By reusing things, perhaps not for their original purpose, but by reusing things, this saves the need to buy something new. Similarly for repair. And then finally, if something has reached the end of its useful life, we can recycle it. Composting, I'll speak a lot more about this in a little while, but composting is a very easy way to deal with organic waste. So this perhaps sounds a little hyperbolic, but I think this is not unreasonable to say that we should vote like the future of life on Earth depends on it. Climate change is a crisis, and we really need to act like it's a crisis, and you know, we need to vote as if it's a crisis. So yeah, eating less meat, especially beef and lamb. I won't talk too much about the sort of the sustainable aspects of food production and that sort of thing today. But it is simply the case that beef and lamb have by far the biggest carbon footprint of any food. And so some things you can do: eat less meat, maybe go meat free one day a week. If it's something that you find you like and is enjoyable, then go vegetarian, go vegan. These are all great things to do. And it's cheaper as well in general to not buy meat. So normalize talking about these issues and also their solutions. So that's really what I'm trying to do today, is trying to point out some actually quite simple things that people can do. And I think we have to normalize talk about these things, because for a long time they've been sort of a fringe thing, almost a hippie idea sort of thing. But we need to make these normal things that people can get on board about caring about. So obviously this one doesn't affect climate change, so pick up litter whenever you see it. That doesn't affect climate change, but it really speaks to that definition of sustainability that I gave at the beginning. Carpooling, public transport are fairly straightforward things. You know, it saves carbon emissions from the car. You'll save money as well. If two people carpool and they drive on alternate days, you're spending half as much on petrol. Everyone wins. Yeah, so I'll just mention this in passing. This could be a much larger discussion, but I'll mention in passing a lot of sustainability initiatives and actions that people can take tend to be more expensive than a less sustainable counterpart. And that is unfortunate, but it is regrettably the case. And so some of these later ones will not be applicable to everyone. And that's absolutely fine. That's simply the system we live in. That's the society we live in. But I do think we should all do what we can. Anyway, yes. So choose how, where, and on what you spend your money. So this you might have heard also described as voting with your wallet. This is a good way. If lots of people do it, this is a great way to get companies and industry to change. They exist to make a profit. And if we don't support things that aren't sustainable, then eventually they'll stop doing that. And so just to give one very simple example of this, if you have two similar products in a shop and one is wrapped in plastic and one isn't, go for the one that isn't wrapped in plastic. Yep, installing solar panels at home. This is really obvious how it helps. It's expensive, so it's not for everyone. You also may not own your own home. I live in an apartment, so I can't do this. There are government grants if this is something you want to look into, certainly in the ACT, I assume elsewhere also. And even in the ACT, so this is something else I won't talk too much about. I could talk for ages. The electricity used in the ACT is not all renewable, despite what the government suggests. They're very careful not to say it, so that happens. So even in the ACT, this is a useful thing to do to reduce carbon emissions. And electric vehicles for the same reason. Okay, so those are just some ideas, the sort of things that we as individuals or communities can do. And so I think one of the most obvious things that probably people already do is recycling. And we all sort of, I hope we all sort of know, recycling is a good thing. But why is recycling a good thing? So I've got some notes. So one of the most obvious things is it saves finite resources. Things like metal and glass are not renewable, but there are other issues as well. So mining for metals, for example, it's a polluting process, it threatens species, and it disproportionately impacts indigenous people, both here in Australia, but also around the world. This is true. And so, once again, I've clipped some examples from the news. I suspect many of us will remember from last year when Rio Tinto, mining company in Australia, destroyed an ancient Aboriginal site in the Juukan Gorge. This had been inhabited for at least 46,000 years, and I believe it was the oldest continuously inhabited inland site in Australia. But this was destroyed to mine iron ore. That same company, Rio Tinto, they'll no longer be given welcome to country ceremonies by Indigenous people. In the Hunter Valley, there's at least one example of a coal mine where they don't have enough funds to rehabilitate the land once the coal has been extracted. And I believe they don't have enough funds by a staggering amount, in fact. It's estimated to cost around $25 billion to rehabilitate the land properly, and they've set aside around $1 billion. And so ultimately that will be a cost borne by the taxpayer. And then finally, there's this example from the Solomon Islands, just to show this isn't limited to Australia. There's an island in the Solomon Islands that's basically been destroyed by mining and logging coming in. And of course, the people who live there don't see the profits. That's all moved offshore. Okay, so anything we can do to reduce this is surely a good thing. Similarly, deforestation is a threat to species. It can lead to soil degradation and pollution. It increases fire danger. And in Australia, at least, and in some other places also, it's very weakly regulated. And what regulations there are not often enforced. So yeah, Australia is the only developed nation in the world that is listed as a deforestation hotspot. I've got an example down here of the effect it can have on threatened species. So this is a swift parrot. They are threatened. not many left. If you're very lucky, you may have seen some in the ACT in the last few months. They're one of only 2 species of migratory parrot in Australia, I think, both endangered. But then these images on the right-hand side show the legal logging that happens to their nesting sites. As well as legal logging, Vic Forests, who are terrible for this sort of thing, they conduct illegal logging, which, amongst other things, puts Melbourne's water catchment at risk. So this is mainly due to runoff from the bare ground. As I mentioned right at the beginning, koalas are at risk in New South Wales, and part of that was due to land clearing. There's a similar example of that here, where this ecologically rich area of forest in the New South Wales has been exploited for coal mines over the last sort of 15 or so years. So yeah, anything we can do to reduce deforestation is again a good thing. Plastics, for the most part, are derived from oil. Oil has to be dug out, has to be extracted from the ground, refined. It's an energy expensive process. Okay, so again, as well as saving resources, we save energy. So for example, metals take a lot less energy to recycle than it takes to make new metal by processing ore. And so the example I give here is for aluminium, which takes approximately 90% less energy to recycle it than to make it from scratch, make it from aluminium ore. There's also actually carbon emissions associated with not the energy use, but the chemical method to create metal from metal ore. Essentially, you have to remove the oxygen from the metal oxide, and it has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is usually onto carbon, which makes more carbon dioxide. So it's a double whammy. Why do we want to save energy? Well, for all the renewable energy that is made around the world at the moment, the majority is still from fossil fuels. And so this little figure on the right is showing global energy consumption for the last 20 years, and broken down by how the energy was produced. So these 3 very big contributions on the left are fossil fuels, and then the 2 on the right are renewables. And so wind and solar will be lumped in together in this one on the right-hand side. And it's encouraging to see that there's sort of exponential growth in this sector, but obviously fossil fuels are still completely dominating. Okay, so I think it's fairly reasonable to say that recycling is a good thing, but is it always a good thing? So it's unfortunately the case, certainly in Australia, you can follow all the rules, all your local council rules for what you can put in your recycling bin. You can do that all perfectly, and some of it may still end up in landfill. So this is especially true for glass and plastic. So just as an example, this is a photo of an enormous warehouse full of glass waiting to be recycled in New South Wales, one of many. But it's just cheaper to import new glass bottles than to recycle old ones. E-waste is sometimes shipped to other countries, either ends up in landfill or it's burnt. There's some examples from Ghana on the right-hand side here. This isn't such a big problem for Australia. but that's only because most of the e-waste in Australia ends up in landfill in Australia. And then a little statistic, in 2017 to 18, less than 10% of plastic used in Australia was recycled. So I'm not saying don't put things in the recycling bin, of course you should. If you put it in the general waste, it certainly won't be recycled. But if we can reduce the amount of waste we're producing, then that's even better. Now, of course, we can't always reduce it. We'll always end up with some sort of waste. And so I'd like to now talk about some alternatives. So there's this company called TerraCycle, who I think are fantastic. Their goal is, they call it recycling the unrecyclable. They offer a number of free recycling options, which are subsidized by industry, which is how they can be economically viable. And they include paid options for more or less everything else that you can think of. These paid options are quite expensive, so this is another thing where it's certainly not for everybody. But the free options are great, I think. If you want to find out more about that, you can Google TerraCycle brigades, that's what they call them. And you can find drop-off places local to you. What I've done is start up a collection for these sorts of things at work. And that's what this picture on the left is showing. It's just one of these little stations. And this was really easy and cheap to set up. This storage box at the bottom cost $2 secondhand. And then all I needed to do was print out some things from the TerraCycle website. And I'm good to go. Yeah, so I mean, this is something that can easily be done. So this is an example of the sort of thing that I actually have at work. This is an updated version of what you see. This is actually an old picture on this one. This is the new updated version. And you can see there's a huge variety of things that we can collect and keep out of landfill. Now you may quite fairly say, if you have a look around on this poster, you might say things like dishwashing liquid bottles. Can't I just put those in my recycling bin? And of course you can. But as I discussed just a few slides ago, it may end up not being recycled. The good thing, or one of the good things about TerraCycle, is what you send them all gets recycled. Because it's subsidized by industry, they can compete with, they can sell the end product at a competitive price. And so that's how they're able to do that. Not everything on here is taken by TerraCycle. There are other free recycling things that can be done. And so, for example, disposable coffee cups, things like that. So like soft drinks, that sort of thing, and plastic lids and straws. They can go to 7-Eleven's Cup Rescue scheme. So I think all 7-Elevens in Australia will have a place where you can drop these things off. You're likely to see in sort of shopping centres these sorts of specialised bins for these cups are becoming more common. We take glass jars to be reused. So there's a food co-op on the ANU campus where you take a jar along and they'll fill it up with stuff for you. And we provide jars for reuse for them. So that's great. They don't need to buy new ones. We take in things like metal bottle tops as well, because these are too small to go in the recycling bin at home. But of course, they're completely recyclable. Metal is infinitely recyclable. And if one person, if just a single household is collecting these, it sort of doesn't add up to much. But by collecting everyone at work, that's 100 people, it quickly adds up, and it's then sort of worthwhile to collect these, and they can just be taken to a scrap for that. So sort of more on the practical side of things now, something I found really useful is creating these simple graphics just to go up around work. And so the approach I've tried to take is keep them quite simple, with a sort of standard layout of a fact, a problem about that fact, and then a solution. And I found this is a really effective way to get people to engage with these things and to use them. And if this is something that you'd be interested in doing, I'd be very happy to share these templates. You're welcome to send me an email. If you missed it at the beginning, it's also at the end. But I'll just point out, in particular, this one on the right. This has worked really well. So it starts off with a fact: when organic waste goes to landfill, it breaks down and produces methane. That's a problem because methane is around 25 times more effective a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And the solution is compost. And I think this has worked particularly well because I put these up above the general waste bins. It's so people don't need to remember to do this. They can see it exactly when they need to be reminded, and that's why I think it's worked really well. They don't need to constantly have it in their mind. They, if I send out an email, they'll read it and forget. Whereas this is, it's precisely when they need to see it, and they go, "Oh yes, I'll put that in the correct bin." And then eventually, this becomes habitual. Eventually, they don't need to see this. Eventually, they're used to putting things in the compost bin. So this is really effective. So, speaking of organic waste, as I said, landfills, organic waste in landfill breaks down anaerobically. So, in an environment where there isn't very much oxygen. So landfill, when stuff goes to landfill, it's compacted as much as possible because they want to fit as much stuff in. When it rains, it gets waterlogged, and so you quickly lose any oxygen that's in there. The issue with with this is that the sort of decomposition you get in that environment produces methane, and methane is 25 times more potent than CO2 in terms of its greenhouse gas effectiveness. So as I suggested, it's a lot better to compost. And so now I'll talk about the sort of the setup that I've got at work, and also composting a little more generally in a minute. So what we've done is we have food waste bins in every kitchen. So people can just drop it in there. They don't need to come to the composting site. And then at the end of the week, every week, I'll go around and swap out the bins. And it's very low effort on the part of people using the system, which I think is something else I should have mentioned earlier. If you want, the best way to get people to use this is to make it easy for them. So perhaps unexpectedly, the main aim of composting for me isn't to produce compost. It's to keep organic material out of landfill for the reasons I've gone through. And so we do, it's so-called no rules composting or one rule composting, which essentially what that means is we put everything in. So it's anything organic. If it was recently alive is essentially the rule. And so paper, for example, is counted as being recently alive. So we've ended up collecting around 8 kilos per week at work. And so people can also bring in stuff from home. It's very much encouraged. And I estimate we get somewhere around 30 kilos a week from people's homes. So there's a question, a very good question in the Q&A, which is, how do you keep rodents and other pests away from the compost while also keeping the whole system easy for people who aren't used to composting? So that's a great question. I think we've been lucky in part. So we're in a relatively isolated location on a mountain away from built-up areas, and so I don't think there are many pests sort of there to take over, if you see what I mean. We don't have rats on the site anyway. There is a family of dunnuts that live underneath the compost heap, which they look like mice. They're native rodents. They're very cute. As far as I'm concerned, they're not a pest. They keep the cockroach population down. So that's another thing. We don't get cockroaches here. I've seen 2, both of them quite early on when we started this, but none since seeing the donuts. I haven't seen any cockroaches. So I think it's partially luck. Yeah, keeping the whole system easy to use for people who aren't used to composting. So essentially, the only action people need to do is put things in. Any other management of the compost system is done by me. So there's a big list that is sort of available internally to the site of the sort of things you can put in. And for the most part, people have been doing absolutely fine, like no issues at all. But no, that's a really good question. And it's certainly something to consider. Maybe I'll come back to that later on as well. But yeah, good question. Okay. So, yes. So the setup we've got here is we've got these four distinct bays separated by pallets. And the way we've ended up doing it is we have organic waste, wherever that's coming from, and that all goes into the first bay. So that's fresh organic material. That sort of takes about a month or so to fill up, depending on how many people are using it. But then once that's getting quite full, that goes over into the second bay. This is where the most active decomposition takes place. So I turn it into the second bay with a fork. This mixes everything up. It adds a lot of oxygen. I'll also put in usually some wood shavings from a local furniture maker as well at this point. That helps soak up any excess moisture. It also provides a good sort of substrate for fungal and mycelial activity, which is good for a healthy soil later on. Yeah, so this is, like I say, where the most active decomposition happens. The temperature will get sort of up to 50, 60 degrees centigrade, and that's hot enough to kill weed seeds, for example. So you can put weeds from the garden in here. It's hot enough to, if you put pet droppings in here, it can sterilize the bad stuff in those and make those safe. I've just got a few pictures on the left as well from when I've dug one of these out. You can see the decomposition isn't complete. There's still recognizable things in there if I were to zoom in. But you can see a lot of stuff has broken down. You can see this this white gray material. This is the sort of fungusy stuff, the fungus mycelium that we want to keep. Oh wait, hang on. Yeah, so this again, we'll leave this in here for a month or two. In that time, it usually loses roughly half its volume. from going in. So that's really good. Yep, so then after that, we move it along into the third bay to rest and to mature. The temperature will drop quite significantly, and of course the composting process is still active, things will still be breaking down, but at a much slower speed now. And then after that, a few months later, we have finished compost. And I've put finished in inverted commas here. It really depends what's gone in at the start. So like I say, we take everything. That can include bones, fruit seeds, stones, that sort of thing, sticks, woody objects. That's all okay to go in here. And so this finished compost, if you didn't put those sorts of things in, if you just had, the sorts of things that are actually shown in this first image, they would all be broken down nicely by here. But we want to take out some of those difficult things, and so we have this extra step where we very coarsely sieve it. And so, yeah, it's again, a very simple, very basic setup. This is just a bread tray from Baker's Delight, and resting on some pallets. Tip the compost in the top, let it fall through, and so you'll get woody bits and all sorts falling through, but the very big stuff won't be able to get through. And then that just goes straight back into the beginning to go around this system again. So that's so that's our setup. This again, it was fairly straightforward, like the TerraCycle recycling boxes on inside. This is all quite straightforward to do. Pallets you can get for free. You can pick them up from the roadside. So especially in more industrial areas, so people in Canberra, places like Mitchell and Fishwick, you can just drive around and there's pallets on the roadside. You can also have a look online, places like Facebook Marketplace and Gumtree. People who have had something delivered on a pallet and want to get rid of it, there's always pallets available. The chicken wire and the staples, this was the most expensive part, probably around $50 for what we've got going. I will say, if I were to do this again, so this whole thing was sort of an experiment for me. If I were to do this again, I'd probably use either chicken wire with smaller holes, or I'd use some sort of welded wire mesh. But what we have now works perfectly fine. The garden fork that I used for turning it, that was $5 secondhand from Facebook Marketplace. Again, you can get stuff like this really cheap. And it's reusing it rather than getting it new. It probably took me around 10 person-hours to put together completely. I think it would be, if there were two of you, it would be quicker than 5 hours. The whole thing would just be easier with two pairs of hands. But no, again, it wasn't particularly onerous. Like I said, it's fairly cheap, quick and easy to set up. And once it's set up, that's it. That will last several years before it needs maintenance. So that was our setup, but you can go as simple and passive or as sophisticated and active as you like if you want to set up one of these sorts of things for yourself. So, you can, a pile of organic material will rot, and that could be considered a compost heap, and that could be a very simple way of doing it. It's usually better to have it in some sort of enclosure. They heat up and decompose more quickly if you do that. And there's much more sophisticated things you can do as well. You can worry about the carbon to nitrogen ratios, and if you want to get more into the science of composting, YouTube has hundreds of videos on it. I've lost hours to that. So what could you do, for yourself if you don't have space at work? I'm lucky where I am. There's ample space. Maybe you don't have space at work. Well, maybe you can set up compost at home. This is really easy to do. Again, it takes very little effort once it's initially set up. If you can't do that, maybe a co-worker would like your food scraps. This is what I did before I actually set up the stuff at work. My boss used to take all my stuff. There's also something I think is fantastic. There's this company called Share Waste. And so I'm just showing on the right a map of the share waste locations in Canberra. And you can see they're everywhere. And so what Share Waste does is it connects people who want a way to keep their organic waste out of landfill, but don't have the space, or maybe they don't have the time, with people who want extra organic waste for their garden, or indeed, as you can see from some of the markers, for their chickens. And so it connects these two groups of people. So a very good question in the Q&A. I'd like to set up composting myself, but I live in an apartment building and I'm disabled and wouldn't be able to manage it myself. What would you suggest for that? Do body corporates encourage this sort of thing? So perhaps the second half of that is easier to answer. I suspect no, they don't. Body corporates, in my experience, tend to be more concerned with aesthetics, which isn't to say your body corporate is necessarily like that. You can't hurt to ask. What would I suggest? So, yeah, I think seeing, obviously, seeing what other people in your building or in your complex, getting their thoughts, see if there's a sort of critical mass for people who want to do this sort of thing and are interested. Then that could be, well, that could be a way to encourage body corporate to allow something like this. But you can also set up, you could also get help with people taking your stuff to share waste, to a share waste person as well. So hopefully that answers some questions. Yeah. Someone's also mentioned in the chat bokashi bins. That is a good point. Yes, I completely forgot about those. Yes, so bokashi bins are another way of composting on a small scale. I have one, but I don't use it anymore now that we've got this composting at work. But yes, no, good idea. Okay, so these are the two main things that I've done at work so far. They've been relatively easy to do, which is why relatively easy to do, but also relatively high impact. They can get everyone involved, and so that's why I focused on them. Some other things we've been doing at work. So very excitingly, we've just had 100 kilowatts of solar panels installed, which should pay for themselves in around 3 years. So this, again, it's a benefit of where I work, is that we own the buildings and we can make these sorts of changes. I will say that to get this done, we had to do a lot of the legwork and sort of go out and get quotes from solar companies in order to demonstrate to management that this was something worth doing beyond the environmental reasons for doing it. That, again, it's the system we live in, unfortunately. But yeah, paying for themselves in 3 years, that was good enough. We've got a community garden that's was in the process of being built when the current lockdown in the ACT started, and so this picture on the right is how it was unfortunately left a few weeks ago. But I'm very keen to get back in there. And again, this is less about climate change. This is more about sustainability in general. I'd like people to get a better feel for how long it takes for food to grow and how much water it takes for food to grow, and what really goes into, when they buy something in the supermarket, what's really gone into that. So yeah, it's also hopefully going to be a nice way for people to connect a little bit more with nature, to the extent that a community garden can do that. We're also, so again, this is something that maybe isn't universally applicable, but we're looking into replacing gas heating with electric and retrofitting double glazing. Again, this is because we own the buildings, we can do this sort of thing. Okay, so here are some final thoughts. Yeah, so as I've mentioned, reduce is better than reuse, is better than repair, is better than recycling. All are good, but do them in that order if you can. When you are reusing things, if you're sort of repurposing them, as it were, if you're going to use them for something else, try to think about their end of life as well. Will it still be able to stay out of landfill after you've reused it? So a lot of these things take time to get used to, especially if you're going to try and introduce things at work where other people might not be as on board with all this stuff, or they might not have thought about it as much as you have. It can take time for habits to change, and so don't beat yourself up if you or other people take a while to get into the swing of things. I also suggest starting off gradually. So think about where you can have the biggest impact and what the easiest changes are to make. And also, I suppose, what it's most likely people are going to get engaged with. If you try and go, from 0 to 100 straight away, it might not necessarily work, and that can be quite demoralizing. So I do think it's nice to have step-by-step successes rather than trying to go for everything all at once. Yeah, think creatively. So I've tried to mention things that I haven't spoken about. I've tried to point out where I'm leaving information out. Yeah, so your situation might be different, and what I've said might not directly apply to you. But what I've tried to do is mention things like TerraCycle, like share waste, where these are solutions that you might be able to fit into your situation. Yeah, so finally, if you have any questions after today that haven't been covered, or you find any of the resources, so like those little graphics that I showed, for example, if you find any of those useful, please feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, I think I'm bang on 5 o'clock, and I will leave it there, but I'm happy to take any more questions if people have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. No one can hear clapping, so I'll do it on behalf of everyone.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for that talk. So another thing that was mentioned in the chat is worm farms. Do you have any thoughts on those? Because that was mentioned that might be good for people living in apartments, perhaps.
Yeah, so I don't have any experience with worm farms personally. But as far as I know, yeah, they can work in apartments, absolutely. So yeah, that's also something you can look into. That might be something you could even get at Bunnings, or maybe online. I don't know. But yeah, no, absolutely go for it. There's all sorts of ways of doing this sort of thing.
So how have you found, I guess another personal question, how have you found it working at Mount Stromlo, like the engagement support from, your co-workers? You've been leading a lot of these initiatives, but you've also had some help. How difficult was it getting, people on board? Or do you have any tips for getting people as a help, in their own workplaces?
Yeah. So in terms of getting a sort of a working group together, that's relatively straightforward. There's usually enough people who are passionate about this it's engaging the wider community that I found more challenging. And so I've taken a scattergun approach, I think it's fair to say. So I try to, I have lots of different ways of trying to engage people. So I send out occasional emails because I don't want to bombard people and annoy them with this stuff. I don't want them to see the email and go, that again. So I'll send out an email once every few months. There's a monthly school update that goes out as well that I write a little bit for. And then the passive things like the posters. I think those are probably the best things. But yeah, I'm still trying to find what works best, to be honest.
It's glad that it's good that you have had the engagement from, people, and you haven't just been doing it all on your own. Someone here in the comments mentioned that Gardening Australia recently did a story on worm farms. Small scale ones in polystyrene broccoli boxes work well, and it's reusing a waste product. So I guess give that a Google.
Yep.
I can see that I gave it a Google myself, and there's a YouTube video about it from February. That might be the one that was mentioned. And yeah, someone else mentioned that community gardens are just good for sequestering carbon in the chat, I guess.
Yes, so we're actually half filling the raised beds that I showed in the picture. We're half filling those with old wood and stuff. Just because it's quite a large site, there's inevitably a lot of this waste. And so I have been doing that as well. It's a good.
All right. Well, if no one else has any questions, thank you all for tuning in. I know for those of you that were watching on Facebook, there were some audio issues that I fixed towards the end, but the first part of the talk had some issues, but I'll get that uploaded. So if you weren't able to watch the full thing, it'll get posted to probably our YouTube page, and we'll make a post about that. But thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully, you can take, any of these steps that Phil's proposed and make some changes, because as he said, it's not about doing everything in one go. It's, picking the easier things and, going from there and getting more ambitious as you go and convincing other people to do similar things. Do you have any final words, Phil, before we depart for our Sunday evenings?
Just thank you very much, everyone, for coming. If there's anything more I can do, please get in touch. But yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good Sunday night, and thanks for tuning in for, I guess, a somewhat atypical National Science Week event that was a little bit after National Science Week, but looking forward to everyone starting composting and, making small changes and making a bit of a difference, because, whilst it's not on us to, it's not our problem, we didn't all individually cause climate change, all these things that Phil has spoken about today, they're part of the solution. Composting and recycling, they're all important. So anything you can do, it'll be really helpful for the future. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.